right, here we go. Lisa Seif. I'm here with Lisa Seif, and my name is Mark Funkhouser, and I'm in Reno, Nevada. And actually, Lisa is in Evansville, Indiana,
Yeah.
where I used to be, and that's how we met. And so we're doing a series of conversations on recovery and sobriety. We've been talking about things like this for a long time, and Lisa recently wrote a book and is going to be writing a series, I believe. And her promotion of that has kind of sparked this conversation. And so I just want to introduce my good friend and actually former colleague, Lisa Seif. So Lisa, tell me a little bit about, I want to hear about the book and how that came about. And then let's go into some bio and history.
Oh, sure. Thank you, my friend Mark. Wow. Can you believe you're turning into a Phil Donahue now? You know, there's just, I think one thing you and I always have in common is that the more we know, the more willing we are to learn. And we can learn so much through each other's experiences. And I met you through the courts because I was working with adolescents, and so were you. You were working with them more from the criminal justice perspective, and I was working with them more from treatment and rehabilitation and mental health. So that's
right.
how we met. And my God, that was probably 25 years ago, 2020. And then we started the Outward Bound program together because you really believed, and you mentored me. You really believe that change is only possible when we're moving.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was something in our brain, and you do have to acknowledge first before any change. But when you're moving, Outward Bound was all about getting these kids to move, to learn how to problem solve and handle crisis. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So that's a little of our history. The book, thank you for highlighting and putting a flashlight on that. I've always wanted to write and haven't had the time. And I went to a training in Atlanta a year ago, and they were talking about quote books being so popular now. And I thought, well, the quotes that I heard in the recovery rooms were the most powerful transformations for me, those little one-liners. And my friends used to say, okay, Seif, what's the bumper sticker for today? Because I'd write these little sayings down as I heard them in these meetings early in recovery. And they ended up really transforming the way I think about myself and the world. So when they say quote books are popular, I'm like, oh, good, I'll just pull out a bunch of quotes. Journaling was also important in my recovery and still is in my, even though the media and, iPads and have taken over, I got in recovery. But when I used to write down what I got out of each quote, it helped me internalize it. So I just took that and did quotes and made them kind of journal pages, and it got put on Amazon. I wasn't expecting that, needing that, really wanting that. It was just kind of my little gift back to some of the things that were so important to me in recovery, which was the one-liners and of course the journaling. So that's how Think and Grow Sober got started. And now my next one, which I was hoping would be done in August, it's going to take a little longer, is going to be Think and Grow Sober for women. And it's just going to be women I've met in recovery, women I've met in my profession, and getting some of their favorite quotes. So you'll have to send me some of your favorite quotes and a little bit about them.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I hear you might be doing one for men, so I want to get involved in that one.
Yes.
So
definitely.
yeah, those quotes. And if anybody that's ever been in community-based programming or 12-step or any kind of faith-based or any even the smart recovery and all of that, those quotes have literally kept people alive because they were memorable. Like Keep It Simple was, and they broke it down. I remember, and I'll just I'll tell a little bit about my early days. It's like I remember when I went into treatment in 1987. When I thought about actually having to stay abstinent, or clean and sober at that time is what we called it more, and it was total abstinence back then more so. when I thought about doing that for the rest of my life, it was overwhelming. I wasn't actually sure that I could do it. I mean, I
Oh,
really, I mean, I'm not sure I even wanted, actually, I didn't even want to do it, frankly.
right.
But
No.
there was a part of me that did. And I think the part of, when I came in, the part of me that didn't want to stay clean and sober was huge. And the part of me that did was small. And so over time, it switched and that grew. And those slogans, like keep it simple and breaking it down, the one day at a time concept or the 1 minute at a time concept has literally saved people's lives. Because if you can't do it for today, or at least you don't know whether you can or not, then doing it for the minute or the hour is doable. I can do that. You and I are going to do that, you know, this 30 minutes that we're going to be talking. And that's all we have to worry about right now. So,
And that's the challenge for sure, to get my brain on the runway in the here and the now, for sure.
yeah.
And you're right, those slogans, those quotes are little bits of food that
Yeah.
awakens and inspired me. I couldn't handle too much more than one sentence or one paragraph. I love that our rooms, people don't comment 3-4 minutes. I
Yeah.
can handle listening to people when they're not going on and on and on and on, you know, and
Right.
those are definitely simple and
Mhm.
oh, amazing help to us. You're right. So that's what my whole book's ideas was about.
That's a great approach. So I'm looking forward
Thank
to
you.
reading more about it and hearing more about it. So let's start this series off with, you know, a lot of
Okay.
people may not know what addiction and alcoholism or recovery and sobriety, what they actually mean. And, you know, maybe it's changed over time. You know, we want to discuss that and maybe how it's changed over time. And, you know, one of the things that I learned early on, because I got to start in one place and then I emerged to another particular program, and I had great respect for the many programs actually that I've gotten to know people over time. But you know, and you come at this from a therapeutic standpoint. You've been in treatment based work for a long time and the courts, and so I want to make that clear that, and I come at it from my own perspective in study, but not as much formalized treatment or therapeutic stuff, even though I've done a lot of informal study with that. But let's define alcoholism and addiction, and then move into recovery and sobriety. So how would you define, or how do they differ, and how are they similar?
That is a great question, Mark, because since the American Medical Association determined that alcoholism was a disease, that was in like the middle 1950s. They realized, and I think the founder of the program, Alcoholics Anonymous, and his friend, Dr. Bob and Dr. Silkworth, wrote the doctor's opinion in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Even in the 30s, they knew that there is something about the way we physiologically metabolize alcohol that creates a compulsion. So the American Medical Association bought into that this is an illness. The rest of society didn't. Now, that was the 50s, and you'd have to anonymously go to meetings. Nobody wanted anybody to know they had alcoholism. So that was the name of it in the 50s. It was even the name of it in the 60s, even in the 70s. But with the 60s and the drugs coming in, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous and the medical profession didn't know what to do with that. The Vietnam vets were coming back, and their biggest fear was, are they going to be addicted to heroin? Well, 90% of the Vietnam vets that came back mainstreamed and did very well in society. 10% could not stop that compulsion to use opioids. So then they termed it in the 80s chemical dependency. Well, now, I don't want to take up a lot of time from a historical perspective. Now, oh my God, our book, the DSM-5, has pages of substance use disorders. Each drug is identified, whether it's methamphetamine, amphetamine, cocaine, crack, Adderall. opioids. Now they've even got different diagnoses for each different chemical. So from the 30s to the 50s to now, the names have changed, but the identification of it hasn't. It is an impaired, illogical, insane relationship with a chemical that, when put in the body of the person with this disorder, creates a compulsion that the brain floods. And we haven't really figured out metabolism yet, but the brain just floods with a hunger for more. Well, so we get it, that it's a dependency. There's a tolerance that's built when somebody becomes addicted. There's a lot of people that are heavy users that haven't crossed the line into an addictive use. And now with the process addictions, gambling, pornography, eating disorder, spending, there's just been a lot more research about the brain and addiction. We know that there is something in these individuals, and it's got nothing to do with their religion, their gender, their age, their sad, pitiful story. There is something in their metabolism and their tolerance that gets triggered and causes life problems, and they still can't quit. So that's definitely the major thing. Probably bad things keep happening and they just don't have the capacity to quit. They just can't see it.
Yeah, and I often say, and I come at it somewhat from a lay standpoint, even though I've been in the field in different ways, and especially in peer recovery and in the courts. But I often say that the experts know a lot. There's been so much research done, but really people still have a hard time understanding it, and especially it's almost incomprehensible what we do, what people do for that, and I even think sometimes they talk about the biological predisposition, and I've had some family history, and I've read some of the research about separating twins at birth and some of the genetic components of that. But I also think that we could talk about this for days, is that it's also in our culture, and it's a family system thing. Our culture sort of, the American culture, there's so many wonderful things about it, but one of the things that may contribute to that is that we strive on mass consumption. We churn out goods and services 24/7, 365, so we can have the demand and supply to satisfy us. And you mentioned, some of the substitution, so I want to talk about that a little bit later. So, and one of the other things that I kind of wanted to, let's talk a little bit about recovery and sobriety, because I know that there's a difference, with regard to addiction and alcoholism, especially with the substances things. And you mentioned how the process addiction sort of transfer, or that some people have just gambling addictions and not really from some of the other things. But let's define recovery and sobriety. When I first came in, there was a little bit of confusion about that for me, and some of the programs, get a little testy about it. But how are they similar? Do they really differ at all? And what are the differences, if there are any at all?
Great. Fantastic questions, Mark. I think the difference is, like you said, the cultures are different. If it's a gambling culture or a pornography culture, the process addictions, eating disorders, I think they have different cultural norms than those that are in the methamphetamine culture or now the opioid culture. And I don't say this with malice, but I say this with just experience. And I think I've told you this before. You and I have been dealing with addiction since the 80s, our own recovery, and dealing with the changes of the names and the court rules and the treatment timelines, IOP, day treatment. And we have been dealing with this forever. But since the opioid epidemic, suddenly now it's happened to the more affluent populations in our society. Medically assisted treatment came in like a wave when nobody was prepared for. So I think culturally, now that it's hit the affluent everybody's paying attention. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that as now more people are paying attention, and I think it's changed the stigma a lot. But I do still think the meth addicts look at the opioid addicts and say, I'd never put a needle in my arm. The pornography addicts look at the exhibitionists and say, well, I would never go take my clothes off in front of it. You know, there's still within the cultures this compare and contrast that can block us. We hear a lot about unification and inclusion now. We better be taking care of inclusion in healthcare. And I don't care what meeting people I work with go to, if they can go and get some exposure to the 12 steps, layer by layer, sobriety to me just means wholeness, soundness of mind. What separates us from animals are instinctual. They don't care about, cows don't care how they look. You know, human beings are, we have more than instinct. We have a soul, we have moral codes, and we know right from wrong. So I think when we're addicted, it's almost like an animal instinct has taken over. And when we get dry, whether it's an OA or CODA or SA or GA or A, I don't care. They start wanting to be in recovery and they want to get whole again. And eventually, layer by layer, God willing, they can get better in the quality of their life and the quality of their relationships. I didn't know how to have relationships. I had to learn, and I'm still learning. So my quality of life depends clearly on my relationships with other people. Well, I didn't know how to do that. So I just had to go around and learn the language you guys taught us for a while. So I think the different subcultures have their little stigmas, but I do think inclusion counts here too.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, you know, I experienced different paths, and I think SAMHSA has probably done a lot to talk about the many paths, and that's changed over time. You know, it used to be more about total abstinence, and you mentioned harm reduction and things like that. And that's really had a major change in the field. And, you know, I think one of the things I struggled with early on, partly because I'm a peacemaker and I don't like conflict, and I also experienced help from different, you know, organizations and fellowships, and so I actually had great respect for, you know, both or many, and so we actually even say within the context of a particular way is to focus on the similarities and not the differences, so we can identify and not exclude and disclaim and avoid and deny. But yet we're a little bit reluctant to do that between and among different groups sometimes. And, you know, I think it's part of that, it's the human condition, you know, and you mentioned connection, it's also human connection. And I think ultimately, as we grow and mature in recovery and in life in general, because I actually think at some point recovery and sobriety are more just about living life on life's terms. And although we never want to forget, you know, I always say that, you know, getting clean, or even today with people coming into harm reduction, it's a baseline, but the benchmark is yesterday. You know, if my baseline is the same after 34 years as it was when I came in, and it could be if I had a relapse. So I don't want to discount that or minimize that issue. But by and large, the benchmark is really what matters. It's like, am I doing a better job today than I was yesterday? And that really works no matter where you're at in your recovery. So I do think that if we focus on the common thread and the common bond, and we avoid the conflict, even within organizations, whether it's the workplace or whatever, you know, even gossip, you know, that can be addictive. And so if we focus on the us versus them, and look at our political culture, I don't want to get off a tangent here, but
no, I was just thinking
or even with COVID, you know, a mask, no mask, vaccine, no vaccine. Right. You know, we're not going to go into that, but it's human nature to so I think we really need to, whether we're in a particular program or a way of life or not, or whether someone's in recovery or not, we really need to realize that we're all human at the base. That's our common bond, and
you know,
regardless
Mark,
of anything else.
yes, and you said something too. I think we need to, when we're working with folks, really understand consumption. Because I think you're right. I think we've somehow been programmed to believe more is better, but we never know how much more. And I think recovery is about understanding those boundaries within ourselves between gluttony and being in a safe place with my pleasures. And I also think consumption's a problem here. I'll tell you something else that I see hurting a lot of people. We're not able to be vulnerable. We don't give people permission to be vulnerable. We talk about the fearless, but we never talk about how often they fail, you know, and people that can't ask for help or can't say, I don't know how to do this. They're the ones that I see struggle so much. So yeah, the consumption, but also in our culture across the board, the inability to be vulnerable or to say I failed. Mark, I didn't do good at that. I'm not good at that. It's so hard for people to own that and say that, I think.
Oh yeah. Well,
And,
and Brené Brown has done a lot for
I
that.
love her.
And men, I think, and although sometimes it's switched, but I think men really have a hard time with being vulnerable. And one of the things that I learned early on, and I do a lot of men's work now, and like early on, it's feelings work. It's like, what are we feeling today? How do I cope? Am I sedating, avoiding, denying these feelings? I don't even know what to do with them. Anger was always a man was allowed to express anger, and that's caused major problems over time. But
yeah, God forbid man should be nice. I
right.
had a kid in here last week with his mother, and he's nice. So he gets bullied by other guys and even girls because he's nice. And they pick on him for being nice.
Right. Well, and we need to learn to be assertive too and set boundaries, but that's hard. We could really do a whole session on bullying, but that's a good example. So one of the things I want to move into now, we've got about 10 minutes left in this particular session. We're going to do, I think we're up 4 sessions, but we're going to do these 2. And so I want to know for you, what made the difference in how you sustained over time? And what words of encouragement and support would you have for those who struggle to do so?
Gosh.
It's tough.
I think when somebody's taken into the emergency room, a doctor won't do anything unless the airways are open. So they check to see if the airways are open, right? I think I was so desperate when I came in 1981, and even all those old crusty guys that took up the seats in the rooms back then in the early 80s, this was before the AIDS epidemic, somehow the hope that I felt in that room opened my airways over time. It was CPR at first for me, Mark, because a minute left alone in my head was so uncomfortable. They call it generalized anxiety now. Back then it was called neurosis or hyperactivity. I don't give a crap what the name is. I just was not comfortable in my own skin. And those guys did this psychological and spiritual CPR to open my airways so that I could hear what you all were saying. But for a long time, I just went back for the hope. And I don't think anybody's going to pick up a pencil to do a 4th step, let alone come back to do step 1, unless they have hope. So sometimes I think we expect too much too fast, and time takes care of things for us. I think I needed that in the beginning. And once the airways were open and I had hope, I was willing to follow direction and learn about my ego and my self-centeredness, and learn about my need to change me, that when something's wrong, there is something I need to look at in me. That was foreign. Psychologists and psychiatrists told me it was all because of this or because of that. You guys told me in the program, no, you're the master of your own universe in a way. There's a power greater than myself. So little by little, what has sustained me, I think, is just staying teachable. And really, the main thing probably over 40 years is for me to remind myself I'm not unique, and that I owe every success I've ever experienced, I probably owe to at least 10 failures that came before that.
Yeah, that's huge.
Oh.
Yeah, and so that I remember the early days too, and some of the old timers, and like they'd say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, or
See, they're minor, yeah.
take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. It was kind of, it wasn't quite as, some of that might be less politically correct nowadays, but
I miss that though. I think that
well, I know, well, there were, and they actually said it in a loving manner,
yes.
so I think it has a lot to do with how you say something.
Yes.
But it, things have changed over time. And when I think about success and people have different paths, I always say that it takes what it takes, and everybody has a right to the process. And the process is really different for everybody. There's nuances and things. And, I think the inner critic and the way we beat ourselves up, whether it's a setback that involves a chemical relapse or a physical or process relapse, if you're whether it does or not, okay, we all have setbacks. And like you said,
yeah,
I like the progress, not perfection. That's a quote that we use. And also like the notion that progress is sometimes 3 or 4 steps forward and 1 or 2 back. And even really, sometimes it's even regression. That's not progress, but regression happens. And setbacks are not always about relapse to a substance use, or it could be just having a difficult day. It could be getting off track. We may talk about in subsequent sessions about, switching and substitution and things like that. But I really like what you said about humility and being vulnerable and open to change and leadership and teachable. Because I remember one of the old timers, and is John G. You remember him. He was one of my best friends, and I always looked at. He told me one time. He said, when I first met you, I didn't think you were going to make it, because he thought, and I probably was. He said I was arrogant and I wasn't teachable, and I'm like, who do you think you are? But he saw something in me, and
he opened your airways.
Well, yeah, and talk about humility. I mean, he was the ultimate. He was the ultimate in humility. Yeah. But but none of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. So if we can stay on the path, and the one thing you said was about hope. I've often said that if you lose hope, what else is there? And with suicide rates up and the opioid issue up during the pandemic, and alcohol consumption up, one of the problems is that when you lose hope, that is, where else do you have to go? There's a bottom that's a different bottom for everybody. But ultimately, death is the ultimate bottom, and it's terribly painful to watch people do that, either suddenly or slowly. And we try to instill hope, but it's really kind of an inside job, and maybe that's something bigger. So
think about it, though. Think about it. There's things worse than death. Living the nightmare of our addictions is hell on earth. So we're ready to, like, you let John G. and I let some others open my airways so I could feel the hope.
Yeah. Right.
And you know what I love too about our rooms? There's no number ones. You have to be. There's just no competition there. It's so refreshing. There's no one better sober than anybody else.
Well, and one of my old friends always says, my worst nightmare is that I might live and continue to do this. And then I heard a speaker say one time is that, we think that drugs and alcohol are killing us, and they actually are. But he said that they actually kept me from killing myself. And that really stuck with me. It's like, but it's really both. It's really both, though, because they will eventually kill you.
Yeah.
First spiritually, then emotionally, and then physically. It couldn't happen all in one day with fentanyl and some of the crazy stuff out there now. But he said that it kept me from killing myself. So it was really, and Gabor Mate, talks about the pain and trauma, and we'll talk about that in subsequent. It's really about the pain. It's not so much what we're doing. And some of the old slogans were, it's not so much how often you drink or use, it's what happens when you drink or use. And it's not that I do it every day, but it's what happens when I do it. That's the real indicator. So Lisa, we're wrapping up our first session here, and
Great.
yeah,
Awesome.
it's been really good. I just even connecting with you on the way to this these sessions has been so fruitful and rewarding and refreshing, because it there's one thing that I try not to do when I talk about the past. I try not to wallow in it. And so I want to use it as an indicator for like maybe people that are new, or as a reminder for myself without living there. But reconnecting with people like you have, it's always regenerative and renewed and refreshing to connect with you. So I appreciate
Ditto,
you.
ditto, ditto.
So I look forward to future sessions. So good to talk to you today.
You too, Mark. Go have a great rest of the day. Sober, sane, and stable.
Thank you.